Hello, thank you for joining our Transit Route Review Town Hall. My name is Brendan Wedley. I'll be serving as the moderator for the Town Hall. With the pandemic, we've shifted to this online and telephone format as one way to provide information and hear from the community. Hopefully the technology works as we all expect. If you're attending online through Teams and you lose your connection, please click on live broadcast on your screen when you reconnect to the meeting. The Town Hall is one way to provide input and learn more about the Transit Route Review. The transit team also has a survey that's available at connectptbo.ca/transit, and paper copies are available at the transit terminal at 190 Simcoe Street. You can also share comments and questions with the transit team through the dedicated transit study phone line at 705-933-4756. Today we're going to ask you to keep your questions focused on the Transit Route Review. If you have questions or comments that are not related to transit or the Transit Route Review, please follow up by calling the city at 705-742-7777 or by sending an email to cityptbo@peterborough.ca. The Town Hall is one way to provide input and learn more about the Transit Route Review. We're going to start the Town Hall with a presentation on the 3 route network options that have been posted for comment. The presentation will give a bit of background on the earlier phases of the route review, the concepts for the 3 options being presented, and where it goes from here. We're not asking people to pick one of the options. Rather, we're hoping you'll share your thoughts and questions on the features of each option. Your input will help to inform the recommendations that are being prepared for City Council's consideration. What goes forward could be one of the current options, or based on your input and the ongoing review, it could be a blend of the options. Following the presentation, the panel will be taking questions and comments on the route review. For everyone participating by computer through the online Microsoft Teams feature, questions can be submitted through the Q&A feature on your screen. For everyone participating by phone, we ask that people participating by phone pre-submit questions for the panel based on the information that's been posted on the city website and the project page at connectptbo.ca. If you have questions to come up through today's meeting, please call our dedicated transit study project phone line at 705-933-4756 or email the project team at transitstudy@peterborough.ca. As the moderator for today's meeting, I'll read questions submitted to the panel. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible in today's meeting. Questions that we're not able to get to today will be posted on the project page along with responses from the project team. Before we get right into the presentation and the Q&A session, I will introduce the group around the virtual table with us today. From Peterborough Transit, we have Jennifer Fredericks, Supervisor, Transit Planning and Workforce Management. Trevor Pereira, Supervisor, Transit Planning and Workforce Management. Lori Stratton, Transit Manager. And Kevin Jones, Transportation Manager. Behind the scenes, we have with us today Sharon Hayton and Sarah McKillican from our communications team, helping to provide information and monitoring for questions. And from IBI Group, a design and technology firm that is working with the city on this project, we have David Forsey, Chris Prentice, Josephine Materia. And with that, we will get started with the presentation. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Dave here. I'm actually going to lead us off on the first couple of slides, but I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody to this town hall presentation and thanking you all for your participation. As Brendan mentioned, my name is Dave Forsey. I'm the project manager for the consulting firm that the city's hired to conduct this study. I'll be taking you through some of the slides today, as will my colleagues Chris and Josephine, as Brendan just mentioned. So I'll start by giving a little bit of context about how we got here. The transit study launched in the fall of 2018 with an initial review of how transit service operates in Peterborough and our assessment of needs and opportunities from our review. At the beginning of 2019, we brought our findings to the public as part of the first Public Information Center. And later that year, we began to develop new transit network alternatives for implementation in the near term. Today, we're going to be presenting these alternatives to you and describe some of their features. We'll also be talking a little bit about the long-term vision for transit in Peterborough and tell you how you can participate in this study. Next slide, please. So for a bit more context, I'll explain that there are actually 4 separate components to this transit study. There's the transit route review, which is specifically looking at how the transit network might change in the next couple of years and how to establish a foundation for future growth. And as was mentioned off the top, that's the main focus of today's presentation. There's also the long-term transit growth strategy, which sets a longer range vision for how transit works in Peterborough and how transit service might need to change in the long term. We're also conducting a downtown transit hub plan, which will consider how the operations of the downtown transit terminal might need to be improved or whether the terminal itself needs to be relocated. And finally, there's also a review of accessible transit services that is ongoing that will help develop options to meet community mobility needs. Next slide, please. So again, today we're going to be providing an update predominantly on the transit route review, and specifically that's going to include summarizing what we heard from you during the first round of engagement, which occurred in the winter of 2019, focusing on how people felt about transit at that time, what was working for them and what wasn't working for them. We will review the considerations or critical success factors that transit professionals use when approaching the redevelopment of a new transit route network. So basically the things that help us go from a blank piece of paper to a new transit network. We will present and describe the features of 3 alternative network designs for the route review that were developed by us, the consulting team, and by Peterborough Transit staff. And finally, we'll present some information about new or different ways of providing transit service at times when demand is low or in parts of the city that are difficult to serve with conventional transit. So from here, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Chris, to take you through what we heard from the public during our first round of consultation and some other material in the review. On to you, Chris.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Again, my name is Chris Prentice. I'm the senior transit professional at IBI Group and leading the route review portion of this major study. Now, the slide you have before you, for those of you who don't who are on the phone and can't see, the key topic is key themes from the first round of consultation, and there are 4 bullet points that I'll just review for you. The first one talks about the first round. Again, this is what we heard back from you from the first round, but also informed by our critical analysis of the transit system to start with. So the first one is reducing travel time. In other words, more direct routes is a main priority for most respondents, followed by improving equity and accessibility of transit services across the city. And what that really means is people don't like the way routes, twist and turn going in and out of subdivisions. So they want routes straightened out to reduce the travel time. And then also for services to serve new areas and provide a better quality of service throughout the city. The next bullet point talks about having to transfer downtown, and it's inconvenient for riders. As probably most people know, all of the existing routes currently start and end at the downtown terminal, and that's inconvenient for a number of reasons. One, because of the design of the terminal, where it takes time for buses to get in and out of there, so you're sitting around waiting, plus the design of the routes where they all end there, everybody has to get off the buses and get back on again, and that can be inconvenient. So what we want to do and what we heard is there's a preference for trying to reduce the number of services going down there, number of routes going down there, and downplay having to go downtown. Now, the next bullet talks about low frequency of service on most routes. It's unattractive. In other words, hourly or even 40 minutes is not very convenient. So they want more attractive service, more convenient service from that standpoint. Now, the last bullet talks about suburban neighborhoods are less easily accessible using transit than the downtown Trent and Fleming. So what that is telling us is that people want service going into more outlying areas and developing areas of the city. So we want to restructure the routes to better serve those areas, as well as improving access to Trent and Fleming, since they are a major destination point, as you all know. Next slide, please. Now, this slide talks about factors which influence the transit service success. In other words, as Dave had said at the outset, these are the things that we take into account as transit professionals and your transit management people within Peterborough Transit like and use to be able to make sure that we provide and develop the best network, most effective network. And the first bullet says balanced service coverage and quality. And that means really, again, as I said a moment ago, expanding service across the city, being more equitable, but also serving new areas and positioning the routes, designing the routes so that it's easy to extend them into new areas and you don't have to go and redesign everything. And then service quality is a balance between the frequency of service, walking to the route that it's closer to you, and all of those factors really build up to talk about quality. Another factor is also reliability. So we want routes that are going to be reliable and better on-time performance. Then the next bullet says provide faster and more direct trips to key locations from across the city. And again, that's playing on the previous comment about expanding service to the new areas, more direct service, and tying together all of the big primary locations across the city so that you don't have to go downtown, come back out again. Next bullet says provide convenient transfers. What that means is instead of all having to go downtown, if the routes are structured so that you can transfer elsewhere, that gives you more flexibility. But a key part of that is that the routes have got to come together, timed well, so that you're not standing out on a street corner for 10 or 15 minutes waiting for a bus. So those are the things we want to look at there. Next bullet says minimize duplication, maximize efficiency, and improve on-time performance. So obviously we don't want to have multiple routes running on the same street, even for part of it. We want to make use of the resources that we have in terms of buses and drivers, as well as the budget and revenue hours that we have to invest in transit. And finally, obviously, improving on-time performance. Nobody likes to be waiting around, waiting for a bus, wondering when it's coming. So we want to have improved reliability. Then next bullet says expand and introduce service to new neighborhoods and developing areas. Well, that repeats what I was saying earlier about coverage and quality. Clearly, with the city growing the way it is, particularly on the outsides towards the municipal boundaries, we want to be able to serve those new neighborhoods and do them conveniently to tie them with all the other major destinations. And then the last bullet says reduce routes through the congested downtown terminal. So yes, we want to reduce that both because there are other important destinations within the city and everybody doesn't need and shouldn't have to go through the downtown. So we want to provide greater flexibility that way. Next slide, please. Now on this slide, which is titled Where People Are Traveling, it's a map of the city, and on it we are showing the major travel corridors, the major streets, you know, like Lansdowne and Monaghan and Park Hill, plus Water Street and George Street, which really shows you where the major travel patterns are throughout the city. Also on it, on this map, we are showing the major trip generators in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary ones, for example, are downtown, Trent University, as well as Fleming College. Then secondary ones would be the hospital, Lansdowne Mall, Chemung malls, and shopping area. So this just gives you an indication really of where people are coming from and going to, and how we ought to be linking all those together to come up with a network that is really effective, going to be efficient, and going to attract people to transit. Next slide, please. On this slide, it's titled Where People Are Traveling. And again, it's a map of the city, but it's a map that shows the volume of trips linking all of these various destinations within the city. And it's based on the 2018 traffic survey, and it's based on the PM peak hour, which is 2:30 to 5:30 in the afternoons, weekdays. What it gives you is a real representation of just how complex the travel patterns are, between various destinations and origins within the city. But you can see from it where by the thickness of the lines, where some of the linkages really are in some of the important destinations. Obviously Trent and Fleming are important, but the downtown still remains important, so we don't want to ignore that. Others are, as I said earlier, Shamong area, shopping area, where the malls are up there, as well as the hospital, Lansdowne, and down into the industrial areas. So this gives you an idea, and this is the type of pattern that influences us as we then look at the existing route network and develop new route network options to try and respond to these travel patterns. So there you go. I'll turn this over to Josephine, who is our transit planner, to go through the network alternatives. Josephine?
Thank you, Chris. So this slide is showing the three transit network alternatives that we're considering to address those travel patterns that Chris has just discussed. So each network alternative here illustrates a different planning principle. So you can think of each option as a way to approach how we can meet the travel needs of residents that we identified through the travel survey and through feedback from the first round of consultation. The recommended network will reflect the results of the consultation and the evaluation process. So any feedback that you give us today will be considered when we're developing the final network. The three types of networks that we're looking at are a grid network, which focuses service along corridors with high demand, connecting key destinations using direct routing as much as possible, and adding transfers where direct routing is not possible, but trying to maintain those connections to those key destinations. The radial network is one that focuses service on a key hub or a high demand area, so in this case, downtown Peterborough, providing direct connections to the main hub from other parts of town, and providing time transfers at the main location. The third kind of network is a multi-hub network, which focuses on more than one hub, connecting those hubs with main routes and providing neighborhood coverage, so feeder routes that can bring you to those main hubs where you can catch core routes. The next few slides will give you a bit more detail about how these network alternatives would be developed in the Peterborough context. So with the grid option, we would be looking at creating direct routes to key destinations and new neighborhoods using main corridors. So those key corridors that Chris had highlighted, such as Park Hill, Lansdowne, would be examples of those main corridors. And the service is designed to reduce duplication, so trying to prevent having multiple routes on the same corridors and reduce travel times by making routes as direct as possible. This might mean that some customers will have to travel further to get to a stop because the service is concentrated again along main corridors, but it creates hubs at the downtown terminal and Trent and Fleming, so there's additional capacity to those locations and service provided to those locations. And it also creates more direct connections from Trent, Fleming, and other areas of the cities to other hubs, as opposed to just focusing on the downtown network terminal. This grid network also is meant to reduce operating through the downtown terminal, which might be faster for some customers who don't want to travel through downtown to get to their destination. And that might mean that transfers are happening somewhere else along the Peterborough road network, not just concentrated at the downtown location. This network also increases community bus service to provide localized travel options to key destinations and provide some additional coverage that the grid network might not provide, since it's focusing all of its service on main corridors. The radial network adjusts the former 2019 network, making some routes more direct and removing a few routes from the downtown terminal to make the service a bit more efficient. So the way it does that is by creating more direct connections to Trent and Fleming from other areas in the city. It maintains the downtown terminal as a primary operations hub, however, so that most travelers would probably still have to transfer downtown, which might be indirect for some people, but the timed transfers in the downtown location are maintained so that when you get to downtown, it's easy to make a transfer. It reduces the wait. The wait between transfers is reduced that way. And there might be some challenges in serving new neighborhoods with this network because it's oriented towards the downtown. The Multihap network creates transfer hubs at the downtown terminal, Trent, Fleming, and Willow Creek Plaza. So instead of just focusing all the service at downtown, these additional hubs are being considered for additional service. It creates routes that serve key destinations in those new neighborhoods or in those new hubs. And it reduces operating through the downtown terminal because, again, service is concentrated in these additional hubs. So local routes might have shorter travel distances to bus stops. So with the feeder routes, the neighborhood routes, they would provide more coverage, and the walking distance to a bus stop might be decreased, but more time might be spent on the bus to get to the hub, and you might require more than one transfer to get between different locations. So from your home to your final destination, you might have to go from a neighborhood route to a satellite hub to the main hub. So it also increases community bus service in order to provide that coverage at the neighborhood level. And that's how it maintains shorter walking distance to bus stops for most users at the neighborhood level. I'll pass it on to Chris.
Great, thank you, Josephine. So the alternative service options, it's important to consider the best way to allocate resources as we want to provide not just an efficient service, but we have a fixed amount of money that we want to invest in the services and distribute it really in a priority way to best serve the community and make transit attractive. So the ways to allocate these resources, which is shown on this slide, are, for example, providing service to new neighborhoods, areas where there is lower demand. How do we do that most efficiently? And in areas where there are road network constraints, because some locations, it's not easy to get in and out with regular bus routes. So we want to look at how we might better serve those areas. Regular bus service in these areas may not be justified, both on the basis of demand, but some of these other issues. So some of the service options that we've been looking at would be to expand the existing community bus routes that are out there today, or providing new Transcab locations, building on the Transcab services that have been provided in Peterborough for many years, but adding them in new areas, or introducing new on-demand services. And when we say on-demand, even though Transcab is a bit of an on-demand service, we're looking at things like dial-a-bus perhaps, and that would be served in maybe some of the newer areas, or as we said, also lower demand, lower density areas. Next slide, please. So new on-demand services is what this slide is titled. And what we say is that on-demand or demand responsive transit is a public transit service that responds directly to customer trip requests rather than having vehicles follow a fixed route. But what happens is as people call in to be picked up, there is a travel pattern or almost a route followed as the number of and the location of the various requests are put together. So the vehicle will follow a pattern of picking up and dropping off people. Now, these new technologies have improved in efficiency and effectiveness over the years. Dial-a-bus, Transcab, as you know, here in Peterborough has been around a long time. Dial-a-bus has been around a long time. But now there's new technologies that make the booking of these trips and the design of and the pattern of how these how everyone can be picked up or dropped off much quicker, much more efficient. So on-demand service has the potential to provide improved service either in the late evening when demand is lower, or to areas that regular buses can't serve, as I said earlier, or to areas that have low demand, low density, that really putting a regular route in there just isn't going to attract very many people. So if successful, on-demand service could free up resources to meet service needs during peak demand times or midday or even on weekends throughout the rest of the system. So there's also an on-demand service review in progress that your city transit staff are working on now. So that may bear some fruit. Now, next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thanks, Chris. Josephine, have you advanced? There we go. Perfect. So that concludes the slides on the route review, but I did mention at the beginning of the presentation that the transit study also includes a longer term component that will set the vision for how to develop transit in the longer term beyond the immediate recommendations of the route review. So currently the city's vision for transit is defined in the 2012 Comprehensive Transportation Plan, which is the city's overall long-term blueprint for how it provides transportation infrastructure and services in the future. The city is currently updating that plan as part of a separate exercise, and our long-term transit growth strategy that we're discussing today is going to provide key direction for that update. So a very common measurement or objective when we're making long-term transportation plans is something called mode share. And in a nutshell, what that means is the share of all the trips that are made in a city or an area of a city in a given time. So for example, if people are making 100 trips in a day, so the grand total of all trips being made in a day is 100, and 50 of those are made by transit, then the transit mode share for those trips would be 50%. The chart on this slide shows the daily share of each travel mode in Peterborough as of the year 2018. So this is obviously before COVID. And it shows that about 80% of trips are made by car, 61% as drivers and 19% as passengers. 8% are made on foot, just under 2.5% are made by bike, and about 7% of all trips are made by transit. Of that 7%, a majority of the trips are coming from secondary and post-secondary students. In fact, the transit mode share among those students is upwards of 30%, so 30% of all trips made by students is made on transit. Whereas for everybody else, all non-students, it's at about 3%. And lastly, I'll say that that 7% mode share is fairly stable throughout the day. So there aren't major peaks in transit usage or transit mode share that would be associated with, say, commuter travel when people are going to work. So next slide, please. So why does this matter? Well, if we want to meaningfully improve the role of transit in the city's transportation system, which is basically the objective of the long-term transit growth strategy and consistent with the city's previous transportation policy, that means we have to increase the transit mode share. And by and large, increasing the transit mode share requires providing more transit service. So in other words, if you the more transit service you provide, the greater the likelihood that you'll increase the transit mode share. However, increasing transit service does require more investment in transit service. And the table on this slide presents an estimate of the additional amount of transit service and investment that would be required to achieve different levels of transit mode share. So the table on this slide, again, is showing three different scenarios, three different mode share scenarios, as well as the baseline in 2018. And I'll just quickly run through that. So our baseline, our starting point in 2018, the transit mode share was 7%. And that came from an annual ridership of about 4.6 million people and was achieved for about 142,000 service hours. If we wanted to increase the transit mode share to 8%, that would equate to about 5.3 million riders and would require about 163,000 required service hours. And basically that means you would have to increase the amount of money, the annual budget for transit services by about 14%. Likewise, in scenario 2, if you wanted to achieve a transit mode share of 10%, you would have to increase the transit budget by about 43%. And to hit a transit mode share of 12%, you would have to increase the budget by about 71%. So these are all estimates, and again, I'll stress that these were made before the impact of COVID, and that impact on ridership is something that is going to, obviously it's still evolving, we're not having this conversation in person, and is going to have to be the subject of a specific study in the near future. So just again, to emphasize, those three scenarios are things that we're going to be considering and will form part of the recommendations, or selection of a preferred scenario will be part of our recommendations for the long-term strategy. Next slide, please. So that wraps up the formal content that we'll be presenting today. From here, the route review team will review the feedback that we get today and up until the 26th when the feedback period closes. We'll select a preferred network and develop an implementation and financial plan for presentation to council later this spring. Recommendations on the long-term growth strategy will come later this summer, including recommendations on transit mode share and ridership targets, as well as a longer-term service strategy and the costs associated with it. And finally, one element of the study that we didn't touch on today is the accessible services review. It is currently on pause due to COVID, but is planned to be relaunched in the fall of 2021. And at that point, the study team will collect and review feedback received to date and any new feedback that is received when the study does relaunch. And it will develop service delivery alternatives and submit recommendations. So thanks once again for your participation. And I'll now pass it back to, I guess, Brendan to just reemphasize the different ways that you can get involved in the study from here on out. So Brendan, back to you.